It's time for another edition of Saturday with Seniors, a first-hand look at what life was like in our area in years past. It's brought to you each Saturday morning at 10 by Eisenhower's Tioga County Harley-Davidson. Sales, service, and all the accessories that you need for a great ride. The retail store has gift ideas for the Harley-Davidson rider on your list, from t-shirts to jackets, shot glasses to pint glasses, ride jackets and gloves. Stop in at Eisenhower's, Old Route 15 south of Mansfield. They're proud to sponsor Saturday with Seniors on KC101. And I've got a very special guest. Mr. Jack Eckman is here with us, who has been a lifelong resident. His family's got deep roots here in the Tioga County area. Jack, welcome to the show.
Thank you.
So, Jack, let's start with your family, because your family's been here for generations. When did the Eckman family arrive in Tioga County?
Well, the Eckman family arrived someplace about 1880s, 1890s.
Wow.
And they came from a town in Sweden that I can't pronounce, but it looks like Ökmo Sweden. My grandmother came from Holland in Sweden and Kumla. Those are the places in Sweden that my grandparents came from.
Have you ever been to Sweden, Jack?
I was once. I went to Denmark and then I went to Sweden, but we were over there with other friends and we didn't have a chance to look up relatives, if indeed we had any relatives that are still living in Sweden.
Yeah, but it's kind of fun to go to where your ancestral roots are, right?
It certainly is, Gabe. It's great.
Now, do you know why your family came over? What were they looking for in the United States?
Well, they were looking for freedom. In Sweden, where they worked for the churches, and they didn't feel that they were well respected and were working really hard with very little gain because the churches owned all the property. So that's one of the reasons that they came.
Okay, so they decided to come to the United States. Now, I know that in this area, we had a number of immigrants come from Sweden to help settle this area. So where did your family originally settle?
Well, my grandmother went to Fallbrook, and then they went to Antrim before they finally wound up settling in Morris Run.
What was Morris Run like when they arrived?
I think Morris Run was really a thriving community.
Okay.
Then they built a house in Morris Run in 1903 with the help of their relatives. And it's a little bit unique because so many people in Morris Run, the homes belonged to the coal mines and the mines. But they had private property, and different ones of my relatives owned their own property and owned their own homes.
Now, was your family involved in the mining industry that was going on at that time?
Oh, yes. Actually, there were 4 boys and 1 girl and my aunts and uncles, and there was Bill, which worked in the mines. Charlie worked in the mines, and he got a broken back in the mines, and then he quit mining and went to Canton. My uncle John died in the mines by being crushed between the side of the wall and a coal car. And then my father, Art, he was outside mine foreman in the mines, and I had one aunt who was unemployed most of her life.
Oh, my, yeah. Now, coal mining is difficult work, even under the best of circumstances, but my understanding of the history is that some of the really bad, dangerous things in other places in the United States that did coal mining didn't really happen here as much. What are the family stories of what it was like going down in the mines every day?
As a kid, I used to go into the mines with my dad, and he used to go in on Sundays and start the pumps because the lake mines had a lot of water in it. And my brother and I would go in there, and from the main heading, we would look down in the side places, and it was really scary. It was dark. There was water dripping in there. You could hear gentle cracks and clicks with must be settlings or whatever. It was not a very friendly place.
No. I know in some areas, particularly further east, the coal seams were very deep.
Right.
And so the workers would go down there, and they'd stay there, sometimes they'd stay a couple of days down just because there was so much effort to get them up and down. And they would build rooms for themselves. They would chisel them out, and they'd create places to eat. And so they'd go work the coal seam for a while, and then they'd take a break, and then they'd go back out and do some more mining.
That's true, Gabe. But around here, it was more shallow, and it was mostly drift mining around here until they got into strip mining. The other places, there was shaft mining because it was so deep, and I don't know of any drifts that were that deep.
But nevertheless, it was dangerous work.
Oh, absolutely dangerous work.
In the coal industry, there was famously conflict between the miners who did the work and the folks who ran and owned the mines.
That's correct.
Did your family have any involvement in those conflicts?
Yeah, during the big strike in the early 1900s, my grandparents, because they owned land and a home, they took in some striking miners. I think it was called the 18-month strike, and they took in boarders and helped those families get through the strike.
Yeah, I mean, those strikes were, however you feel about the idea of organized organized labor and going on strike. The point is that it was a big conflict. And for a lot of people who went on strike, very dangerous. Their source of income was gone, and yet they were still refusing to go into the mines until they got some changes. Were there other ways that your family supported the miners?
Well, hunting and fishing was big those days. They had land and they had a couple cows and had milk. And so there were some of those ways that they would support. My dad worked on the road out in Liberty during the summer, because a lot of times they closed the mines during the summer.
Why?
Because there's no need for coal.
Oh, fair. Okay, makes sense.
No need for heat.
I hadn't even thought of that.
And so it wasn't very productive. The other thing, years ago, almost all my relatives fought in the First World War. They were probably drafted, and they were a very patriotic family, as most of the people that came from foreign countries were. They were really strong American and defended their freedom.
That's right. Yeah.
You know,
when people come here to make a better life and they feel like they've been successful, clearly the loyalty is going to be
absolutely
in that place.
Right.
All right, well, let's move a little bit forward in your family history. Tell us about yourself. When were you born, if you don't mind sharing that information?
I was born in Jersey Shore, although my parents lived in Morse Run, but my mother had worked in the hospitals in Jersey Shore. And so myself and my brother and sister, they traveled to Jersey Shore and they were born in that hospital. But I was raised in Morse Run and went to school 6 years in Morse Run, and then I went to Blossburg and graduated in 1957. And that was the last year of Blossburg School. After that, Covington came to school, and then it was North Penn High School.
Right, yeah.
But 57 was the last year.
Let's talk about your childhood a little bit. So it was you, and who were your siblings?
I have one brother and actually 3 sisters, but I only have a brother surviving now. The other ones have passed away.
Okay. Tell us a little bit about what life was like in the Eckman house.
Well, just the ordinary routine. You know, you ran around outside. We had chickens and a couple cows, pigs, and you had to take care of them. But you also had spare time. You didn't have really close neighbors. There was probably 3 or 4 friends of mine. We'd get together during the summer and try to play ball and do things like that. But mostly you just did woods things. We used to go out and build camps out in the woods. We used to also pick ground pine and sell ground pine. As I got older, I mowed lawns. I picked berries. And as I got 16 years old and got a driver's license, then I started working for like West Brothers. And
tell us about West Brothers.
I went and I cleaned cars. And then I used to go to Rochester and an Emporium and places like that and pick up cars and bring them back, and then they took them to the auctions.
So West Brothers was literally an auto dealership at that time.
Oh, yeah, yeah. And that was Jimmy West's father.
Oh, okay.
Foster and Stuart West I worked for, and a little bit for Ronald West.
Okay.
But anyway, some of the work I used to do, like I say, I worked in the foundry. Then I went in the United States Army, Chemical Corps. Then I went back to the foundry. Then you never could afford to go to college years ago, but with the GI Bill, then we were able to go to college. So I went to college and graduated with a degree in special education. Then I worked in the Tioga County Votech School for 9 years.
So when you say special education, nowadays I immediately think of teaching children with special needs.
That's exactly what it is.
Is that what it was back then? So was that a relatively new field at that time?
It really was.
I would think.
In 1971, 72, they passed an act that gave students, the right to an IEP, which is an individual education program. And I was deeply involved in that program all the way through.
So I'm tracking your career, sort of typical country boy, worked at the foundry, ended up studying chemistry, came back to the foundry, and then found yourself in education. What led to that path?
Well, my wife is a teacher, and she graduated from Mansfield University as well as I did. And I'm sure that those days, you needed a job, and I really liked history. There were not very many openings for history teachers, and there were a lot of openings for special needs teachers. So That's how I got into that field.
Okay.
And, it was very rewarding. My first job was in the Tioga County Votech School, working with special needs kids. And I ran a program there called Basic Skills. And to my knowledge, it might have been the first program like that in the state of Pennsylvania.
Did you have a lot of sort of freedom to develop that? Or were you constantly answering to administrators?
No. We had a lot of freedom. Somebody gave us a basic outline. And there were similar programs, but they were never in a Votech school. Ours was the first one that was in a VOTEC school. But we taught masonry, carpentry, electric, small engine repair, and a little welding, just a variety of basic skills is what it was.
So you were pretty much a jack of all trades.
By then I was.
Yeah, you kind of picked it up as you went, right?
Well, that's right. Well, from the car dealership to the foundry to the army, and back and forth. Yeah,
you pick up skills as you need to, right?
You do. You really do.
So tell me about your students. You said it was a very rewarding job because this was a new thing for these kids and for you.
Absolutely.
What was that like?
The students were great to work with in most cases. And I say that when they sent regular special needs kids to the program, it was fantastic. They kind of put students that had special problems that were related to special needs kids, and that was somewhat of a problem. But, they were just great, and I meet them now after all those years, and I'm amazed at how successful they were considering their background. They're just hardworking, and you can overcome all that if you just try,
What you're saying reminds me of, we talked about immigrants who come here. They're capable, they're hardworking, they just need an opportunity.
That's correct.
And that's kind of what you're describing right now.
Yeah. If you think of the immigrants, they couldn't read or write English. They signed their checks with an X, and except, among their own family, they could communicate, and just look at where they got. But it was strictly dependent on hard work rather than reading, writing, and arithmetic.
Right, right. When we talk about the idea of America, you got to step up. You got to do the right thing.
Absolutely right.
But in America, if you're willing to do that, we'll help you find an opportunity where you can thrive.
And the world wasn't as complicated to us now as it was then, but I'm sure it was somewhat complicated to them, who came from places where they were oppressed, had no freedom at all, and were ordered around, and they didn't have to think. When they came here, freedom also means you got to think.
That's right. So how long were you a teacher?
Well, I taught 9 years in the Tioga County VOTEC School from 1973 to 1982.
That was up in Whitneyville, correct?
That's right. Mm-hmm. That big main building was built by the VOTEC.
Oh, okay.
Then I moved over to Elkland. I was there for a few years. Then I got into a program after I was in Elkland for a couple of years, and it was dealing with setting up programs for special needs kids. And it was called Transition, and I was a transition coordinator. So I wound up working with 19 school districts and setting up programs at all the 19 school districts. Not by myself. There was a lot of assistance from the state and other special ed people, but they were quite successul.
How far-reaching were the programs that you created?
I had 4 counties, Bradford, Lake Cummings, Sullivan, and Tioga County.
Oh, man, you were all over the place.
I traveled. I tried to do 2 schools per day. I set up the schedules for them.
Now, when you say transition programs, help the listeners understand what you mean by that.
It was trying to get the kids from the school setting out into the world of work. We tried to do that by getting them like an internship for 6 weeks in a factory restaurant. I had kids working in all different venues, and we were somewhat limited by the child labor laws because that's a strict program and you got to adhere to that. But they did real well, and they should do more of those programs nowadays, but they just don't have the staff or in some cases knowledge of how to set those programs up. And labor laws are great, but they can be a deterrent.
Yeah, we don't want businesses making big profits off of free labor.
That's right. That's right.
But at the same time, there needs to be a way to encourage businesses to take on a person who has special needs.
Because if you pay a teacher, why not pay the guy out in industry something he's also teaching? He's training people for a future. Mm-hmm. So I think that they should be government supported and funded.
Makes sense to me. So is that how you ended your career, is setting up those transition programs?
Yes. And I also used to run a program here for 13 years called Tioga County Career Day. And we set that up along with people from the Job Center and Department of Welfare and different agencies. And we would get all industries over to either Whitneyville or here in Wellsboro. And we'd have people come in and explain to the kids how you become an undertaker, how you become a carpenter, how you become a fireman. And that was a very successful program for about 13 years.
I know a lot of those programs still exist. My wife used to work for Southern Tioga School District in a special needs classroom, and they were very aware of the programs as they were preparing their kids. Basically, like you're saying, basic skills and then eventually transition. Once they became old enough, got to hook them up with some way to make a living, got to hook them up with housing, got to hook them up with the support network they're going to need. Because if they're going to be independent, they need certain tools to help them do that.
And the other thing we used to do at that program, which was really great, is we used to have people from Department of Welfare and different agencies in, so that instead of having 15 case managers, you had one. You coordinate, you didn't have 10 people visiting the house and 10 different sets of rules. You had just one. And it made it so much easier. And those programs should be adhered to, but because of the agencies and the bureaucracy, sometimes it's hard to get them to work together.
Yeah, coordination becomes a challenge.
It surely is.
Mm-hmm. So let's take a step back there and let's go back to your childhood. You mentioned that there weren't a lot of neighbors around, but you went to school. First of all, how did you get to school? Is there a bus that took you, or
no? We lived 9/10 of a mile from the school, and no, there was no buses those days. We walked to school, and it's kind of unique. Years ago, little local school, but we used to get rain days, and our school was in a kind of a low spot, but I never known it to flood. But if it rained really hard up until maybe 10, 11, 12 o'clock, they'd let you go home in the afternoon and get wet on the way home.
Yeah, right. I imagine you didn't mind.
No.
So along with school, what other sort of responsibilities did you have as part of your family?
My job was to split wood, and then my brother would carry it in, and then I had to help carry the coal into the house. During the summer, we had to help my dad with haying, and we went out in the woods and would drag poles down to get the wood into the shed. We used to have to assist with the garden, which we hated. But we did what we were told, and my dad had several dogs. We used to have to water the dogs. But we still had time to go swimming in the stream. There was a stream right by our house, not a very deep stream. But we'd play around in the stream and do stuff like that. And
as a younger person than you, we had a garden. We had all those things. My mom used to can vegetables and make jams, but it was mostly just because they grew up with this idea that you got to gather in food. You got to get as much as you can out of your gardens because you got to get through the winter. Now, in the modern times, the grocery stores always got oranges, even though we don't live anywhere where oranges grow.
Right.
How dependent was your family on what they could self-produce?
They were pretty independent. I was going to mention, I remember just the end of the war years. This is the Second World War, and I remember that they had ration stamps. So my dad raised his own cows, and he had his own chickens and turkeys and things like that. So they were pretty self-sufficient, so they used to trade some of their stamps for other people, and then they would trade for sugar and things like that they,
couldn't produce
themselves. But during the war years, we ate well. Let's put it that way. We ate well. But those days, nobody had anything much. Everybody pretty much hand to mouth, and they went to the Morse Run store and they bought on credit, and then the mine owners took whatever they owed first, and then if there was any extra, then they gave it back to the people.
Right. So the first time you and I met, you were telling me about the Morse Run store. Why don't you give us a little background of what that was originally, and then where we are with it today?
There's a whole lot of history with the Morse Run store. From the beautiful building it was to all the different departments, and during its heyday, it handled everything from some of the better garments from New York City, from Jones of New York and everything. As the town went down, and then the store went down, and then finally it was closed for a few years, and a friend of mine and I bought it. And so we owned the store for maybe 10, 15 years.
So for folks who don't know where the Morse Run store is, where is it geographically? And give us a sense of how big it was.
Well, the Morse Run store was what affectionately was called a store corner, but it was right across from the voting place in Morse Run, and it was right on a really sharp corner. The building was about 50 by 50, which turned out to be about 100 feet. It was a 3-story, beautiful building. It had a cement cellar and then 2 floors, and they sold merchandise for the top 2 floors. But, they sold everything.
So kind of like what they used to call a mercantile or a general store.
Yeah, even refrigerators and stuff like that. I don't know if they ever sold cars, but everything dealing with mines they sold, And
it was the coal mining companies that started the store.
And the coal mining company owned the store for many years, and then they passed a law that they couldn't both own the mines and the store. So cleverly, they sold it to some of their friends. But they still managed to control it up until the mines closed about, 1948, 49 or something. And the family that managed the store then wound up buying the store and ran it for another maybe 10 years or something like that.
Now, when it was owned by the mining operations, it's a well-known story that people would buy on credit, and then on payday, that would be subtracted out.
And not only that, but they'd take it all.
Oh.
They had to pass a law one time that allowed the miners to get like $1 or $2 out of their check. But before that, the miners with the big families didn't see a penny.
Wow, so they would be working, never see cash dollar for what they did.
And they lived in the company houses, and they bought their coal to heat their house from the company, and they were charged for it. So they were just almost like slaves.
Yeah, right. There's no way to get ahead in that situation.
No.
So now I know you purchased the store. What led you to that? I mean, are you planning on selling on credit, Jack, or you got another idea in mind?
No. My friend and I, we used to buy buildings and buy stuff like that. And along with my teaching, I owned apartments. And so it just seemed like a good venture. And it was just a beautiful building. Sadly, there was not much going on in North Run. So we had a few auctions up there and a few rummage sales and a lot of fun. Got a lot of really old things. We had some one-armed bandits that were stored over there.
Tell us about that, the one-armed bandits.
Well, during the war, things were pretty wide open, and some people used to have one-armed bandits, gambling devices, and nobody cared during the war. But after the war, then they got really strict, and somebody had stored them in the building, and they were still in the building.
But there was never gambling in the store?
No, there was never gambling in the store. They were stored there so long that they become antiques. Mm-hmm. And so we just sold them as antiques. And,
there you go. Now, you were telling me once they had a kind of an elaborate system for getting merchandise from the back to the counter where they would be sold.
Right.
Tell us a little bit about that.
That was like an overhead trolley system. And there's only 3 kinds of systems that I've done some research on. One is a pneumatic one where they send a cylinder by compressed air through pipes. Then there's a gravity system that they used in Germany, and it's one side is just higher than the other, and you put things back and forth. And in the Morse Run, they had a system that worked with pulleys and springs, and you would put the money in a little cup. The folding money would go in a clip underneath, and then you'd pull a rope, and it would shoot it over to the office, and the people in the office made the appropriate change and put the receipt in there, and then shot it back over to the counter. And I still have some of that system.
That's fun. And, I mean, in 2020, when we weren't allowed to go into our bank branches, all of a sudden, I hadn't used one of those pneumatic tubes in a very long time, and it was just like, oh yeah, I remember these. Crack them open, put stuff in. And
But the trolley system, as far as we know, there was one place around Scranton or something that had that system, but it was invented in Germany, and the pneumatic system apparently was easier to use, and it's really a unique system.
Was the idea just to keep the cash money where people couldn't be too close to it?
That's correct. No, the girls, they didn't really have any money. They just hand you that little cup, and you got your money out of that cup. But,
that's interesting, yeah.
And those stores years ago, you didn't wait on yourself. You stood at the counter. You told them what they want. They went up and down the aisle and got you a can of corn, and there really wasn't much choices. There were maybe 2 kinds of corn. Or nowadays, there's a big counter.
There's a whole counter of just corn.
Just corn, yeah.
And that was just because, especially during the war, everything was being rationed out very carefully, right?
Extremely short supply. Food wasn't too bad, but like meats were scarce, and tires and gasoline and anything that could be used for the war effort, metals, all that was really in short supply and used for the military.
My parents used to tell stories about the special thing that they would get at Christmas, and they both lived through the war like you.
Yeah.
So it tended to be something like my father was like an orange.
Yeah, that's correct.
So what about your family? What was a big deal present for you?
An orange around Christmas time, or an apple sometime around there, was really special. But I remember I was like maybe in first grade when the war was over, and people just went nuts. There was trucks, because nobody had any gasoline to drive many cars, but the industry, they had gas. And they had benches in the back of the trucks, and people driving up and down the road, drinking, happy, waving flags. You could hear shots in the distance with people celebrating. And I remember my school teacher that was really straight-laced and hardly ever smiled, running around in school. She had a little hand siren that she wound it like that and running from classroom to classroom. It was really a festive event,
Sure.
As a kid, I really remember seeing all those trucks running with all the people screaming and shouting in the back of them.
Is that how you found out the war had ended?
Well, earlier in the day in school, somebody got the word, and then they naturally sent us all home. Everything cut down that day.
And that was Victory in Europe Day.
Yeah.
Shortly thereafter, the Japanese forces surrendered as well, and there was yet another celebration.
That's right. But I don't remember only the one celebration, because I was born in 1938, and that was 1945, so I was 7 years old.
How aware were you of, other than there was a war, because all the men were gone?
Oh, very aware. Okay. We could listen to the news every day, every night on the radio, and so many people in town were in the service. Even my dad almost got drafted, and we were really really worried about that in my family because he was in his 40s, but they didn't quite need him. But they were set up, except for the people that were exempt or in a really restricted area. Like some of the head coal miners, they couldn't draft because they needed the coal.
Right, yeah.
But most people went.
Was there a movie theater that you would go to?
In Morris Run, they had a movie theater back in the heyday.
I remember that there was one there. Where was that located?
It was right around where the Mennonite church is in Morris Run, right across from Bowery Street. The town during its heyday really had a lot. It had a beautiful dance hall, had marble counters, everything. I mean, it was really an upscale town for maybe 20 years, 30 years.
A ballroom. I'm assuming dance bands would come and play
there. Yeah, they had a pipe organ in that building. I mean, it was really, really upscale. The superintendent lived very well in that town, and a lot of other businesses were in town. And I mean, there was a lot of dependence on Blossburg for some things, but not for clothing or not for food. I mean, I was all supplied.
Modern times, we forget that in the course of a history of a place, like the northern tier of Pennsylvania, there was boom and there was bust. When the lumber industry was big, when the coal industry was big, there was a lot of money here.
That's correct.
Those what have like to spend,
Right, that's right.
Mm-hmm.
They had chauffeurs that drove their cars, some of the people that were wealthy, and drove great big long, whatever they were, and Moons and probably LaSalle's and Cadillacs way back then. But they lived real well and they had really highly decorative home. Although Morris Run never benefited because so many of the houses belonged to the coal company, benefited by having too many really outstanding and beautiful homes. If you think back, these little bitty towns, there's kind of stable population today, but at one time they had hundreds and hundreds and maybe thousands of people, and they really contributed a lot to Pennsylvania. They had the timber industry. They contributed a lot to the tanneries for the leather industry. And then it'd be, like you say, 20 or 30 years, and then they had coal, and they did a lot for the coal industry during the war. Then after the war, strip mining got to be big, and these little towns were really stripped a lot of the deeper coal and a lot of the pillars that they couldn't take out when they were drift mining. Millions and millions of dollars came out of the little towns, and they paid a price. They polluted the streams, and coal burned sometimes on top of the ground, catch on fire, burned for years, and, they paid a price. Whether they ever got it back or not, it's hard to say.
Well, that's it. Whenever there's a big pile of money, someone's going to take a lot of it and go someplace else with it.
They do.
That's capitalism. That's how that works, right?
That's right. And the gas industry now is contributing and getting a lot of gas around those little communities, under those communities.
All right, Jack, if you were called up to speak for the years that you've been here in this area, what would you say are some of the notable differences from when you were a boy and today?
The technology is just so much advanced, it's hard to believe. I mean, I can remember we couldn't even get TV without, special adaptations. Hunting and fishing that used to be great sports are really dying sports. We don't have the animals. I remember when they'd go out hunting, they would put their game in a feed bag, and they'd have a half a feed bag full of rabbits and squirrels, ringnecks, grouse. A lot of that stuff is non-existent anymore. And the deer population has increased. Years ago, there wasn't very many deer, but that's one big change I noticed. And the automobiles are a lot better than they used to be years ago. You couldn't drive without a flat tire. The tires were terrible. Mm-hmm. So there's big improvements in that area. I don't know about the law and order. In these small towns, they didn't need a lot. People took care of themselves. And we don't, thank God, have the trouble that they have in major metropolitan areas.
We do have challenges, though, but it does feel like the approach can be different because the scale's a little bit different. But it's still going to be really difficult. And it's not just, crime, punishment. It's also what's creating the situation that's driving all of this.
I see a problem with government getting too strong and taking too much control, imposing too many rules and regulations on people. It just costs millions and millions of dollars extra that you have to go through all these different rules and regulations. They were well intended. When they started, they were good. They just got too many people working on it that really don't understand what they're supposed to be doing.
Right. Folks closest to the problem are probably
absolutely right.
Folks most likely to have a solution. They just need the support.
That's
right.
As
you mentioned, you got well-intentioned folks running these transition programs, but they've got too much work.
Yeah, that's right.
Well, listen, Jack, I want to thank you very much for taking some time to come into our studios. Appreciate it very much. I know when I first met you and you started telling me stories, I'm like, I got to get this guy on Saturday with Seniors. He's got some great stories. So appreciate you coming out. Thank you for the time, and you have yourself yourself a great day.
Okay, Gabe, and thanks for inviting me, and I appreciate sharing some of my experiences.
You've been listening to Saturday with Seniors, brought to you by Eisenhower's Tioga County Harley-Davidson. If you're a veteran, thank you for your service. Stop into Eisenhower's and ask for your free Veterans Pass to the Tioga County Fair. If you missed any of the past episodes of Saturday with Seniors, just go to youtube.com and find our channel, or simply search Saturday with Seniors on YouTube to find the